What is happening, y'all? Cowboy here, and I am pumped to finally bring you some footage of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. So Activision flew me out to New York for an event. I was able to go hands-on with the game for quite a few hours and get a feel for it. And in today's video, we're going to be jumping straight in. I got 20 minutes of footage I'm allowed to bring you, and we're going to be talking about everything I got to experience with the game. So the first thing I want to jump into is a discussion about the gameplay and what to expect from Sekiro, because a lot of people have been curious, how is this game going to differ from the Souls-likes that we've come to know? And gameplay-wise, to me, if we have to put it in terms of previous FromSoftware titles, it feels almost like a fusion of Bloodborne mixed with Tenchu. You have a lot of kind of stealthing about the map, if you will, dispatching enemies as you can. If you're able to stealth up to an enemy, you can instant kill them. But at the same time, when combat breaks out, it's very fast-paced. It's very, high movement, dashing around, and in particular, being able to deflect, the equivalent of parrying in the Souls-like games, is incredibly important. So much so that it's a mainstay of the combat, which we're going to discuss more in a little bit. But because of that, in a sense, this almost feels like a modern reincarnation of a Tenchu game. And that's not a bad thing. It's a very, very cool thing, in fact, because the stealth aspect of this I found highly enjoyable. But at the same time, by no means should you consider Sekiro to be a stealth game. Taking a look at the combat in particular, the combat follows a posture-based system. And what this ends up meaning is, as you attack enemies and you get into combat, via doing damage and dodging attacks and whatnot, it will build up a gauge, and then eventually when the gauge reaches full, you're able to execute a death blow attack, which will then kill the enemy. So to better demonstrate this, I got some footage fighting one of the generals. These are essentially elite enemies and can be found throughout the game. And you can see a gauge right below my character, and that's my posture gauge, and the one above the enemy, and that's his posture gauge. And as the attacks are going in and I'm getting off deflects, you can see the gauge is building on up. And eventually, once it's built up high enough, I'll be able to execute my death blow, which you see here finishing off the enemy. Elite enemies in particular usually have at least 2 different bars of health, represented by those little red circles that you saw there. And so you have to continually dodge and deflect and what have you to help build up enough posture damage to be able to execute the death blow. So circling back to my point about deflects and why they're such an integral part of the gameplay here, being able to execute perfect deflects on enemies is the most significant gain you're going to see to your posture gauge. And because of that, if you've always been bad at parrying in Souls-likes, you're probably going to be in for a bad time here. And just to be clear, you can still do damage just through your basic attacks or using your ninja tools as you've seen me doing, but the majority of your damage is going to come from death blows, and you're going to get those death blows off by executing perfect deflects, hence why they're so important. The combat isn't just dodging and deflecting, though. You do have abilities that you're able to unlock. You have this AoE whirlwind attack that you're watching me do right here, which is able to hit multiple enemies. You have your ninja tools available, which range from shurikens to flamethrowers to an axe that's hidden inside of your arm. So it's not just, deflect and hit, deflect and hit. The combat is a lot more in-depth than that, but the core system of it is going to be timing, getting your deflects off, and executing your enemies. So moving away from the combat, let's talk about the level design and exploring the world a bit, because exploring Sekiro was truly one of the most enjoyable experiences I think I've had with modern gaming. The addition of the rope dart and allowing you to zip on up to rooftops, zip on up to trees, and adding that verticality not only into the world but into the gameplay itself was an experience that I don't think I've had in quite some time in modern gaming. Like, to be honest, off the top of my head, I can't think of a game that had this level of mobility when you're exploring the world and deciding your approach. And that's something that's really beautiful about this game that I think is going to make it such a standout title. The only game I can think of really that even comes close to this level of exploration is like Breath of the Wild, and how you're able to climb up just about anything and kind of find your own way through the level. But even then, it's more of a, there's large open plains, there's mountainy areas. And what's so beautiful about Sekiro is the way it all weaves in together. You could go through this area just on foot, fighting everything you encounter. You could go through on the rooftops, looking to dispatch enemies stealthily with death blows. You could do a combination where you take out a couple with death blows, disengage, re-engage the enemy, kind of how you see me doing right here. And honestly, I think that's the thing I enjoyed most about my time with Sekiro. It wasn't so much, you know, the gameplay was slick, the gameplay was fun, exploring the world looked cool, it had a nice aesthetic, but the freedom in approach is probably what I enjoyed the most about this game. Deciding whether you were going to go in or go stealth. As you saw right there, I died and used my resurrection mechanic. You know, using your resurrection mechanic as part of your exploration even. You could effectively rush ahead farther into the level, end up dying, waiting for the enemies to de-aggro and kind of go back to where they were, and then resurrect and continue onward. And so you really have unrivaled freedom in this game in terms of how you're going to explore and make your way through the world. Now, since you just saw a death and us resurrect, let's take a moment to dive into those mechanics and explain how they work in Sekiro. So up until now, with our experience in both Souls and Bloodborne, the basic gist is we die, we drop all of our resources. If we make it back to them, we get them all back. If we die, they're gone forever. And in Sekiro, things have changed up a little bit. So when you experience a death, initially you can resurrect, and if you die again, you're dead for good. And we're going to call this a true death for the sake of this discussion. And when you experience a true death, you lose half of all of your current resources. Now, this is a pretty interesting mix-up because, you know, we're used to just losing all of them if we can't make it back. And while at first glance that almost seems less punishing, personally, I feel it's going to be more mentally taxing. And the reason for this is when you think about Bloodborne or Souls, you know, you make that dash back to the boss that you died against. You end up dying before you manage to get your souls back. And at that point, to me at least, it's almost cathartic, you know? You have nothing on the line anymore, and you go into this mindset of, it's just me and the boss, and there's nothing to worry about. Whereas in Sekiro, you have this continual loss of resources that'll just keep happening, you know? You're going to go down to 50% of what you had, then 25, then 12.5, then 6.25. And while it's not as punishing from a loss of resources perspective, I feel it becomes more mentally taxing because, I mean, eventually you're going to reach that point where you have nothing else to lose, but every single death takes a little bit more out of you. And from the perspective of trying to progress, I think that'll end up being a little bit more stressful, at least to me, I feel. So let's talk about more of the resurrection mechanic and how that works. So for the purpose of this discussion, we're actually going to work with a couple of stills just so you can read along if you'd like. But the basic gist is early on in the game, we gain the ability to resurrect by using a charge of something known as resurrective power. After that charge has been used, it can be replenished either by killing enemies or alternatively by resting at a sculptor's idol. Now, sculptor's idols are this game's version of bonfires. You're going to find them throughout the world. So between killing enemies and hunting down sculptor's idols, you never go too long without being able to resurrect as long as you're properly exploring your environment. Now earlier I mentioned losing 50% of your resources on a true death, but that's not all there is to this picture. We also have a mechanic known as unseen aid, and the higher your percentage of unseen aid, the higher the chance that you actually won't end up losing any resources on death. Now initially during testing I wasn't able to figure out all the mechanics surrounding this, but I do know there's items that you can use that'll help influence this, increase the chance of it, and what have you. So as we go through the game, that's another thing to keep in mind. The higher your unseen aid, the more you can kind of, you know, be aggressive and not so much worry about the loss of resources. But it doesn't end there. No, we also have something known as Dragon Rot. So after getting the ability to resurrect, we also have the ability to spread something known as Dragon Rot. And the basic gist is the more we die, the more Dragon Rot is going to be spread throughout the world, and in particular, it's going to affect the various people that we've come into contact with. As you can see here, looking at the Rot Essence Sculptor and Rot Essence Sacred Maiden, these are two people in the world that have been affected by the Dragon Rot. There's various items you can find to help cure them of Dragon Rot, but the basic gist is Dragon Rot is the negative system corresponding to unseen aid. So as you keep dying, people end up getting sick, and you need to cure that sickness to keep your chance of unseen aid as high as possible to help minimize the loss of resources. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about the environment, because I think one of the things that folks come to appreciate the most out of these Souls-like games is the overall level design and scale you feel when you go through the worlds. You know, especially in Dark Souls in particular, you know, you're just this one little dude that's traversing this world that has just massive cathedrals, massive monuments off in the distance, and the sense of scale you feel is really unrivaled in a lot of games. And that still remains true in Sekiro, even more so to a certain extent because of the added element of verticality. Not only are you able to see these structures, but you're also able to climb up them now. looking at least through the various designs of areas. We had the initial area which was kind of covered in snow. Right now we are going through a temple type area where we have the bridge, the water, lots of trees, lots of forest around. Here we're more in like a mountain pass type area. We're able to zip around in the trees and there's a bunch of enemies below. And I think they did a pretty good job of diversifying up the different areas we're going to experience, but at the same time preserving this aesthetic that we would expect from Sengoku era Japan. Which, on that note, during the event I had a chance to interview a couple folks at FromSoftware and ask about that. Given Dark Souls is a very medieval aesthetic and Bloodborne is more Victorian, and those are both more Western culture, it was interesting to see them make a shift back towards, you know, kind of ancient Japan with Sengoku era, and they mentioned going around visiting a lot of historical landmarks and using that to basically taking from that to influence the level design and the world design. So from what I got to experience, it was pretty cool, but more than anything I'm excited to, you know, see the other areas that I didn't get to see at the event and see just how diverse they've made this world. So moving on to our next topic, I wanted to discuss the prosthetic tools you have available as well as some of the ninja skills. In general, it seems the tools all serve a fairly distinct purpose. We have the shuriken, which is decent for chip damage as well as interrupts. You have the flamethrower, which is decent for like interrupts and crowd control. You had the trick axe, which was good for just upfront damage and a little bit more burst. So instead of making them, you know, big special abilities, I would almost go as far as to say is they each kind of have a utility surrounding them, but each does have a distinct use that it's good for. Taking a look at the skill tree, you can see we have three main different types: combat arts, shinobi arts, and latent skills. Your skills are actually what ends up getting acquired with the experience that you gain as you play through the game. Unfortunately, a lot of the skill tree is actually locked behind previous choices, so as you can see, we can't even really see what we're able to unlock until we pick up the prior skill in the tier, but at the very least this should give you an idea of kind of how the skill tree will work. Additionally, as for leveling up your character, we do something called physical enhancement, which happens from collecting prayer beads found throughout the world, and after you find 4, you can then use those to increase both your vitality and posture. Kind of in a similar state, to increase the amount of heals you have available, you have to locate something called gourd seeds. And on the note of items, we still have a bunch of different consumables to choose from, as is standard for Souls games. We have stuff that increases the amount of gold enemies drop, stuff that buffs you, secondary heals, items that get rid of status, all kinds of different stuff. So rest assured there will be plenty of items to dig through and read about to get more lore aspects of the game. Which, on that note, let's transition into the lore. So one of the questions that was asked during the interview is, you know, how lore intensive will this game be? Will it be telling a story more like God of War? Will it be, you know, similar to what we've come to expect from Dark Souls and Bloodborne, where it's still very obscure and you need to find out stuff through various item descriptions and whatnot? And the basic takeaway I got is that we are going to still have a Souls-like system where a lot of the lore is going to be learned through reading item descriptions, talking to NPCs. They did confirm that there's obviously going to be cutscenes in the game, but they're still going to be minimalistic, so kind of similar to Souls, where a cutscene is used to add effect to something, but it's not there to tell a story. Now moving on, let's talk about the bosses, because this is where the difficulty curve in Sekiro really reaches peak. And as many of you guys know, I'd consider myself a Souls vet. I've played through Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, Bloodborne, Neo, Lords of the Fallen, Salt and Sanctuary. Pretty much anything that follows that Souls-like formula, I've played through and beaten. And with all that being said, Sekiro is on a different level. So much so on a different level that I think it may be too hard for a lot of people. So right now we're fighting something called the Chained Ogre. I would consider this to be a mini-boss. Right there, he did one of his grab attacks, and look at that chunk of damage. Now, that obviously seems like a lot of damage, and I want to touch on why it hit so hard. Now, what you saw just there is known as a perilous attack. Elite enemies or bosses have perilous attacks, and the basic idea is you can either do a perfect deflect, a dodge to the side, or you can jump over it, but it's going to be depending on the move. So jumping back to some more footage of the Chained Ogre, this is actually the attempt where I managed to kill him, and there's 2 different instances of perilous attacks I want to point out here. So he does a perilous attack where he tries to grab you, which you just saw there, and you can avoid that one by a side dodge, but he also does a perilous attack, which is the one that killed me before, where he'll leap at you and then grab you, which you can only dodge by jumping. In addition, you saw the spearmen there doing perilous attacks, so it's not just bosses and mini-bosses. Pretty much anything that's not a basic enemy could have a stronger attack that could be countered as perilous. So essentially what this breaks down to is you have almost a rock, paper, scissors type system, you know, where you have, they're going to do a key move and you have to have a corresponding dodge to dodge that key move. But what made it so difficult, in my opinion, especially this early on, is one, if this guy hits you, you're getting chunked for almost your entire health bar, and two, the attacks have very similar startups. You can see right there with the grab, he still raises his arms, and only about halfway through that animation can you really tell, like, oh crap, he's going for the dive instead of the grab. And so it was definitely a very challenging encounter. But what I found more interesting is, as I was traveling through the area, I found a like a note, if you will, and it basically had info related to this enemy talking about how he was afraid of fire and fire was his weakness or something along those lines. So I tried to lure the enemy over to a bonfire in the area to no effect, at which point one of the folks hosting the event pointed out that there was a way to get fire through an environmental means like steam vents or something along those lines, and then it would have an impact on the boss fight. And that was really interesting to me because, you know, in Dark Souls and in Bloodborne you encounter enemies and you might encounter optional enemies, but for the most part when you encounter something, usually you're meant to tackle it then and there. And instead in Sekiro we're seeing instances where, you know, you can encounter it. I do end up taking down the Chained Ogre and I end up being successful, but there's ways that you can change the encounter if you decide to come back to it later that would end up making it significantly easier. Now with the Chained Ogre in particular, there were only 2 or 3 enemies I had to kill after respawning before I could safely fight him again, but that's not always the case, and this is one area where I didn't really agree with the game design we see in Sekiro. So the next boss, for example, that I'm about to fight has an entire squad with him that I effectively need to kill off every time I want to attempt the boss, because otherwise they're just going to dismantle me. And while I am able to, you know, stealth through and dispatch each of these enemies without aggroing the boss, the thing is, every time you die, you're going to have to go through this again. And to an extent, I feel that that ends up getting exhausting as a player. You know, taking Souls and Bloodborne as an example, with both of those games, you know, eventually, once you know where the boss is at, once you know where the enemies are, you essentially sprint past, and you try the boss, and you try the boss, and you try the boss, until eventually you defeat it. Very rarely would I say that you kill every single enemy along the path on your way to reattempt a boss, and here, we're seeing I have to dispatch 6 separate enemies before I can safely make an attack at the boss. And while it's not hard to dispatch these enemies, and I was able to stealth through and dispatch all of them without issue, that's still like an extra almost minute worth of time you have to spend before each boss fight, aside from the run to get back to the boss, just to kill the general enemies surrounding him. And I have some really mixed feelings about that. In a game that prides itself on hyper difficult combat that is commonly considered, you know, difficult but fair, I think a big recurring theme, of course, is you're gonna end up fighting things multiple times. Unless you have absolutely perfect execution of every single one of your moves, it's probably gonna take multiple attempts to take down a boss. Sometimes as many as 10 or 20 attempts. You know, I remember back with Nameless King, Christ, I think I spent close to about 2 hours the first time I fought him before I figured out a good strategy to take him down. And while that's not going to be the case with every enemy, needless to say, it can definitely get sort of tedious when not only are you reattempting the boss, but you have to take out his entire entourage before you can even make an attempt at him. And I know you might be thinking, hold on, Cowboy, these guys are optional bosses, you don't need to fight them, what are you trying to prove? And the thing is, these optional bosses are what end up dropping your prayer beads a lot of the time. So, I got a prayer bead off this guy, I got a prayer bead off the ogre, and, you know, when you consider that, it's like, well, I can skip this guy and try to make my way towards the real boss of this level, but if I don't kill all of them, I'm going to have less vitality, I'm going to have less posture, and I'm going to be worse for wear because of failing to properly clear the level. So essentially, you're forced into a situation where either you clear out everything or you're punished for it. But despite that one complaint, I thoroughly enjoyed the time I got to spend playing Sekiro, and am most definitely looking forward to launch at the end of the month. I know initially the first step is going to be doing a full Let's Play of the game, and then from there I'll do some walkthrough prep on stream, and eventually produce the 100% walkthrough similar to how I did with the Souls series. So definitely a lot of content to look forward to. As for this last clip, just to give a little bit of context here, this was actually towards the end of the event. I was trying to make my way towards one of the bosses, and one of the event organizers basically did a quick speed run on over there. And I thought it was really cool just showing how fast you can traverse through the world, especially given how speedrun centric the Souls community is. This game's going to be like a wet dream for them. But either way, guys, that's going to be all there is for this one. We are only allowed to bring you guys 20 minutes of footage, so unfortunately I got to wrap it on up. But rest assured, more Sekiro will be coming your way soon enough. If you guys have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below. Even though I can only do 20 minutes of footage, I am allowed to answer as many questions as you have. And with that being said, I hope you guys are excited as I am, because we got a lot of Sekiro coming your way.